Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. Welcome to this lecture about the presidency and how it relates to the rest of the executive branch. I have some notes. I actually have a full prepared lecture here. I want to go over somewhat kind of based on your textbook, your Cox, Hahn, and Heath textbook, but also some based on some of the questions that are being put to you in your essay questions that concern the presidency. So, are there two different ideal types of archetypes, the way that Democrats and Republicans organize their White Houses, and describe those differences? What's the relationship between the executive office of the president and the cabinet? And what's the difference between them and how they can relate to each other, and give some examples. So, in addition to that, there's a couple other points I want to talk to you about. The vice president, the first lady, for a couple of those. But also a few other points you might find interesting that you might be able to add to your essay. Perhaps talking about signing statements and different models of how the executive office is organized. But then also what are some of the ways that historically presidents have staffed their White Houses, and how has that affected the rest of the executive branch? And what kind of size are we talking about here? First of all, to get an idea, let's talk about the cabinet. It's 15 departments, and they are in the secretaries of each cabinet department are in the presidential line of succession, something that is really taken directly from the British monarchy vocabulary. So you've all seen, if you've seen Designated Survivor, maybe if you've seen that show, it's a good show. It's on Netflix. I'm not sure if it's on Netflix anymore. It was on ABC initially. But stars Kiefer Sutherland as in the lead. It's based on this idea of you have to have someone wait out the State of the Union and important speeches that everyone attends, so that in case everyone dies who's attending the president's speech, if there's a disaster like that, there's still a continuity of government. And in this TV show, Designated Survivor, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development is the one who stays. He's in the basement of the White House. He's in a sweatshirt eating pizza. His wife is there. They're having a little pizza party and watching the State of the Union on the TV during this. And during this, the State of the Union address in the Capitol, something really bad happens. He's actually about to lose his job the next day, and something like that, some drama like that. But he becomes the president when there's an attack on the Capitol. So, Hollywood has tried to make hay of presidential succession for quite a while now. So that's not new. But this is one way that we can kind of engage with our politics, right? It's kind of, their tenuous hold on power, supposedly. And there are 15 cabinet departments. There's also, in addition to those 15, I believe 7 that are cabinet level departments that don't have to be that do have to be confirmed by the Senate, but some of those do not have to be confirmed by the Senate. The Chief of Staff, for example. We'll get to that in a minute. So they come to cabinet meetings, which is a pretty low bar for seriousness. But they're coming to cabinet meetings. In addition to that, they have the ear of the president. They have responsibility over policy. They have a budget. So cabinet level is another meaning. So that's the Environmental Protection Agency, the Director of National Drug Control Policy, and the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Those are all important jobs. They have cabinet level appointments. A lot of these are actually in the executive office of the president too. Beyond Chief of Staff, I'm not sure that any of the cabinet level appointments don't have Senate confirmation, but I could be wrong about that. So just because they're cabinet level doesn't mean they can't also be in the executive office of the president, the EOP, which is typically housed in the old executive office building across the street from the White House. The Environmental Protection Agency is actually within a cabinet department, within the Secretary of the Interior's department. But they're kind of seen as different jobs. I think eventually a president is going to, or Congress will split those agencies, but for now they're the same thing. There are roughly 1,200 appointments that have to be confirmed by the Senate every 4 years when a new president is sworn in, and 8,000 political jobs that can be reappointed every 4 years that do not require Senate confirmation. So, political jobs meaning within one of the cabinet departments, like the Department of State, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice. All of those departments have jobs within them that can be reappointed every 4 years. So 8,000 of those. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, so the president can appoint whoever they want to fill that job for the next 4 years. So these are partisan appointments. So that makes you think, well, maybe the whole federal government is just politicized. Well, there are over 3 million civilian employees of the federal government. Actually, no, I think that's wrong. I think it's 3 million employees, including civilian employees. I think there's it's about 1 million or so enlisted and enlisted people and officers, as well as 2 million civilian employees. So most of the people have, or at least I hope most of those people would seem to have civil service protection for their jobs. And that's something we can talk more about in class if you want, but in any of your questions. But in the executive branch, there's been a history of different political patronage systems, starting with, of course, the Federalist Party, which believed in this kind of aristocracy of education. And so the most qualified people were appointed. Jefferson sought, to make the White House more common, more accessible to the common people in many ways. He would often answer the door, whereas that's something that Washington or Adams would ever think to do. But it was still early days, and Jefferson's successors kind of kept and even brought back a little bit more of the formality, to the point where the Jackson administration in the 1820s and 30s were actually seen as kind of rude and uncouth compared to previous administrations. And that's where the instance of the spoils system came into a legend and reality. So the spoils system, of course, the quote, if you haven't heard it, to the victor go the spoils, meaning that a president can, I think to paraphrase Jackson, I believe he said at one point, if there's not a job in the federal government that a Democrat can't do, then I don't want to know about it, or something. Then I don't think we should have it, something like that. Or I've not seen it yet. I think that's what it is. So Jackson felt like he could appoint whoever he wished and didn't have to really worry about education or expertise. And so political parties began in earnest during the Jackson era because it allowed political parties to reward their supporters with jobs and so on, and incentivize them, those people who wanted federal jobs, to support candidates for federal office, and to both fund and give up their time and energy to elect people to office. So both the Democratic and later the Whig and Republican parties began to be electoral machines in that way. At the city level, they really became machines. They took the model, they put it into reality, into systems within urban political environments as well, registering people so they'd be a member of your party who would vote for your party in every election, for example. Registering new immigrants and new kind of uneducated people, basically, to just say, point them in this direction, say, please vote in that election for this candidate, and then we'll be good and you'll be part of our political establishment, and we'll reward you with things. But that whole 19th century, of course, in the middle of all that, in the Civil War, there's a good book called Yankee Leviathan by Richard Franklin Bensell at Cornell University. And he argues, and most people who've studied it, that the Civil War was essentially fought by the Republican Party in the North, and they remade the federal government in kind of undertaking that whole war effort. So I wouldn't say the Civil War is an exception to the rule. If anything, they accelerated this idea of the spoils system. But about 20 years after the beginning of the Civil War, there was a tragic circumstance that caused the public to really rethink their acceptance of this idea of the spoils system and the federal government. And that was the assassination of James Garfield. Uh, let's see. James Garfield is assassinated and lingers for several months and dies. This is in 1881. And it's by a jilted office seeker. Uh, he is this scandal. This is a scandal that grips the nation, especially and even while Garfield is dying, which happens for about 2 months, I believe. I can never seem to get that timeline right, but I believe he's shot, you know, in July, and then lingers until September for about 2 months. Um, so yeah, and so his successor, Chester Arthur, who is this political patronage boss from New York, who ends up being the one who has to really sign into law the end, or at least the end of an era of political patronage and the spoils system, as he knows it, and it's called the Civil Service Reform Act, or the Pendleton Act. So he's able to sign that into law, but he's never reelected in his own right. But this signals the end of the beginning of the civil service protection, and those of us in Sacramento, where I live, in this area, know that the civil service is the bread and butter of California state government, as it is in many state capitals. That a lot of people in the Sacramento area are somehow connected to civil service jobs at the state. So if you don't know someone, if you don't have one yourself, but if you know someone in your family in the region that you live in any state in the country, there may be someone you know who has a civil service job. It's this idea that you essentially have property rights to your job. You can't be fired without cause. So you're not as vulnerable as people in the rest of the economy. This kind of originated with the Civil Service Reform Act in the federal government back then. And it wasn't until Franklin D. Roosevelt, though, that you started to see those political party jobs sort of brought back in the form of rewarding people who were part of those old political machines who wanted back in to the federal government. But they also brought along labor unions at the time, as well as academics. So that kind of began a transformation of the Democratic Party again during that New Deal era. And it wasn't until you saw Reagan really try to not only bring back some of the spoils system explicitly, but also get rid of civil service protections through breaking labor unions over labor collective bargaining negotiations. The air traffic controllers had a negotiating standoff with Reagan in 1981. So he just fired them. And so that was a heavy symbolic move in terms of organized labor, but it also made a direct difference in the federal government. So just to move on, the fact that we now sort of have a hybrid model of civil service protection and not a hybrid model in political appointees. So it creates a pretty wide universe of employment there in the executive branch. But let me just draw the distinction that I haven't made clear yet that is necessary. So the cabinet versus the executive office of the president is the more traditional, appointments that you're used to hearing about. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General. All those offices are simply appointments made by every new president. And sometimes people last all 4 years. But in the middle of a term, once they're appointed, they have to get the constitutionally required advice and consent of the Senate in order to take office. And there are exceptions to this. Sometimes presidents will make recess appointments, which are this kind of weird technicality that just allows people to hold office for about 2 years until the next recess, which allows them to get around the Senate if they don't think someone is going to be Senate confirmable. It used to be just an administrative loophole, but it's become a very politicized tool that some presidents have chosen to use. But it's mostly, it's still your standard issue appointments and confirmations, especially among that 1,200 that I mentioned. Excuse me. But cabinet level appointments, including, for example, the new UN climate envoy and the UN ambassador, is a cabinet level appointment, kind of right below the Secretary of State, but is not Secretary of State. So that's a cabinet level appointment. And the executive office is maybe a more intriguing one. That's got a lot of attention in the last few years. The executive office of the president has about 500 total employees, but it's kind of the people that work directly with the president and the various offices within it. The biggest office within it is the Office of Management and Budget, and they help set a budget policy and numbers and also manage White House personnel within that office, and as well as the entire executive branch. So they really have a lot of power, the Office of Management and Budget. So that's really maybe one of the centers of power in the White House today. And they also kind of help set the direction of the administration. But then there's the Chief of Staff. The Chief of Staff is the person who the president usually sees the most on any given day, COS. They're kind of a funnel of activity. There is a hierarchical model that is used in organizing White Houses, with the Chief of Staff really at the top and the president at the top above that. And then there's there's kind of a collegial model that tends to be used, or historically has been used more in democratic administrations, that are sometimes called the spokes of a wheel model. The hierarchical model of organizing the White House versus the collegial or competitive model are very simple, really. There was no position of Chief of Staff in democratic administrations for a while. And there really wasn't an organized White House staff of any kind for a long time. There were certainly White House staff, or people that worked there, but it didn't have a formal structure until maybe the Roosevelt administration, the Franklin Roosevelt administration, to be clear. And at that point, it really became necessary to start doing a lot more heavy coordination because the federal government was growing. The power of the presidency was growing itself, and the U.S. was growing in power. So it became necessary to create more positions to be able to meet this need. And the Chief of Staff was not, readily appointed. It was something of an Eisenhower innovation. There were, to be sure, special assistants to the president in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations that tended to be their traffic cop, if you will, their person who was their touchstone for all things administrative. But there may have been several of those kinds of people. But in Eisenhower, he brought the governor of New Hampshire in, Sherman Adams, who was really very good at administering the White House and also having good relationships with Capitol Hill, and so in Congress. He was the former governor of New Hampshire, and he had been instrumental in getting Eisenhower elected, but he was also a businessman from New Hampshire and had interests across the country in manufacturing. I forget exactly what his industry was, but he was very competent. And for Eisenhower, that's really what his administration was supposed to be about, was just competence. But, he got brought down by a scandal. Nothing that today would be considered a scandal, be kind of laughable. He got a coat for his wife or something like that. It was kind of this instance of, bribery. Today I think that would be pretty small potatoes. But Republican presidents like Nixon were fine with kind of delegating a lot of authority to a chief of staff that sounded a lot like a military office, right? Chief of staff. It's probably Eisenhower might have been the one who came up with the position's title. And it allowed them to kind of take on more of their public salesperson role in the administration, presidents. Whereas the chief of staff could do all the necessary deal making and political behind the scenes work and administrative work that it needs to be done in the White House. So the chief of staff became sort of a power behind the throne, if you will, and that's certainly how journalists report about it. And I think there's a certain degree of truth, but I think there's a certain limit to that truth. And the Democrats tended to be, I would say, half a dozen or so. We're talking about Kennedy and Johnson and also Carter and Clinton, really. They're kind of the more, personally, these academic, young intellectual types. They preferred a more open and collegial environment, and they tried various forms of either not having a chief of staff or not having an all-powerful chief of staff. One that doesn't necessarily make decisions or is just another voice in the room and is not really the voice of the president as it is Republican administrations. But they all ended up really, for the most part, all of them in the latter parts of their presidency, ended up canning that model in favor of the more Republican-oriented chief of staff model. And Obama never even pretended to have that collegial model. He just had a chief of staff right away. And that was very much in charge of his agenda. That was Rahm Emanuel, who later became mayor of Chicago. And he was able to pass, I guess, the healthcare legislation was his primary objective in the Obama administration's overriding objective in the first 18 months. And really right after that was when Emanuel quit and resigned to run for mayor of Chicago. And so Obama continued to have chiefs of staff after that, of course. But that's really the signature achievement of the Obama administration, and it was due in large part to the chief of staff being in charge of that agenda. But the chief of staff is a very important position. And one thing that's interesting is that it's been studied a lot in Presidential Studies Quarterly in the journal that we're assigning for this course. And it's a position that has a lot of interesting features, a lot of interesting backgrounds of office holders. So frequently what's been going on is that the Office of Management and Budget, the director of that office, which again is the largest office within the executive branch, the executive office of the president, it ends up getting somehow appointed chief of staff. The OMB director ends up being the chief of staff frequently, and I think every administration this has happened since the first Bush administration. So at some point or another, someone who was the head of OMB ends up being the White House chief of staff. Let's see. So it's the kind of chief manager, and this usually happens either in the second term or in the latter part of the first term. So it's kind of the chief manager within the administration and so who gets appointed to this budget position? Often people who are kind of financially or economically backgrounded, or they have a business background of some kind. These are people who, again, see the president most often. So there is a case to be made, I think, that the chief of staff, is a pretty persuasive one actually, chief of staff has become the way, or one way, in which the business sector, the industrial sector, whatever you want to call it within the U.S., is able to quite literally have the ear of the president on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis. Let's see. So besides that, there's quite a bit in your chapter. So is that something that we need to take note of? That's really the question. So besides that, there's quite a bit in your chapter that I would turn your attention to, in addition to the kind of competitive versus hierarchical model of organizing the Chief of Staff office in particular, and the White House staff. There's also a fair bit amount, the daily briefing book and memos and speeches that report to Congress that have to be made on a regular basis. I would urge you to take a look at that because they all involve administrative tasks by people who have various levels of access to the president. And, the example of Nixon is one that kind of pervades all of this study about the executive branch because he really attempted to to turn the White House into his own kind of personal political operation. He was the first one in quite a while anyway to do that. And he had been the vice president, so he really knew his way around the presidency. He was Eisenhower's vice president in the 50s for 8 years. So that brings me to the two different models of seeing the vice president, right? The VP. So one of them is as a rival and the other one is as a potential successor. The rival idea really comes all the way back from Thomas Jefferson being John Adams' vice president. And after the establishment of presidential running mates and tickets and really political parties, that really shouldn't have been possible anymore, this whole rivalry idea. However, John C. Calhoun, way back then, that defender of slavery, that very noxious defender of slavery from South Carolina, under two presidents, he was vice president under two presidents who didn't like him and saw him as too ambitious and too focused and too much of a defender of slavery. Adams and Jackson, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And they didn't like him and he didn't like them. He wasn't very likable. He was a proponent of slavery as a positive good. That was actually one of his speeches. He was, in favor of the secession of South Carolina and other states from the Union if they can get their way, if they didn't get their way. And besides those examples, there are more contemporary ones, probably Henry Wallace, who was the leader of a progressive faction against the Roosevelt administration while he was vice president, and he ultimately caused Roosevelt to dump him from the ticket in 1944 while he was vice president. And later on, vice presidents like Dick Cheney, Al Gore, and most recently, Joe Biden and perhaps Mike Pence, and now Kamala Harris are all really active within the administrations. So they're not the rival, they're often seen as the potential successor. And so there are two models that ultimately we need to reconcile. And by the way, the traditional kind of first lady and first partner, traditional first lady role is one of supporting the president, typically choosing one issue to speak about that doesn't really contradict administration policy or orientation. But there's another activist role that has been assumed definitely by Hillary Clinton during the Bill Clinton administration. And then before that, Eleanor Roosevelt was really her model, even after Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. So those are the two and she was no longer First Lady, properly speaking. So those are the two kind of models of the First Lady office. And now we have Doug Emhoff, who is he's not the first partner, I'm not sure what he's called, maybe the second partner. But he's the vice president's partner. I'm not sure he would be the first gentleman if Kamala Harris were president. But I think that has yet to be determined, his title. I'm sure that they're working with the title, I just don't know what it is right now. But he's been doing a lot of public appearances, and he's been doing a lot of work that you would expect to see someone in his position doing. That is the spouse of the vice president. And up until then, it's been a very gendered role, and now he's a man, and he's essentially an ambassador for the administration in formal settings, and that's something that all vice presidents' spouses have been doing up until now. So just the fact that he's a man, I think, is just something that people are not used to seeing. And were Kamala's to ascend to the presidency in some way, whether through election or through some other succession, if Biden were to resign or die, Kamala Harris would be the first in line, and she actually was the acting president at one point already when Biden had a medical procedure where he had anesthesia, which is a typical thing that vice presidents have been doing. Did not happen under the Trump administration. Mike Pence did not get to be acting president for a day. But Dick Cheney did in the Bush administration, and I'm not sure if Joe Biden did during the Obama administration or not. But this time around, it's already happened, and Kamala Harris is the first woman to be the president, even for a day, as acting president in the White House. And so for that period of time, Doug Emhoff was the first gentleman. Anyway, let's see. So there are some of the central issues that we talk about. These are some of the central issues we talk about when we talk about the White House. And we should talk more about these maybe in the discussion and maybe in your individual questions and in your essays. But now you'll have, in this first unit, you'll have 4 videos from me, including the syllabus video, and a relatively short number of topics for these. I mean, there's only so much time in these videos. So let's talk more as we go forward, and for now, that's all I have on the executive branch, and I look forward to talking with you more and hearing your questions. Thanks for watching.